Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon. My guest today is John O'Neill. He is the best-selling author of the 2004 New York Times #1 bestseller, Unfit for Command. The book was credited by its New York Times review as a decisive influence in the 2004 presidential race. Unfit for Command ultimately sold 700,000 copies and was the #5 nonfiction bestseller in 2004. O'Neill, a United States Naval Academy graduate, a lawyer, and a former United States Supreme Court law clerk to Chief Justice William Rehnquist. He has made a lifetime study of Roman archaeology, traveling throughout the Roman world to visit sites and digs. The Fisherman's Tomb is the first book O'Neill has chosen to write since 2004 because it is a story that should be told. The incredible, sometimes shocking, story of the 75-year search and its key players has never been fully told until now. The quest for the tomb would pit one of the 20th century's most talented archaeologists, a woman, against top Vatican insiders. The Fisherman's Tomb is a story of the triumph of the faith and genius against all odds, and it will be our topic of discussion today. Welcome, John O'Neill.
Well, thank you. I'm really proud to be here, Rob.
You know, when you include secret and Vatican in the title, you're going to draw a little interest.
Well, thank you. Yeah, the book actually has been translated now into many languages, and a movie's being made of it.
John, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have Paulaner Salvatore Doppelbock from the Paulaner Brewery in Munich, Germany. Back in the 1600s, monks were the true master brewers of the day. They were making the best beer in the entire world. Paulaner monks wanted to try something just a little different, make a beer specifically for Lent. Now, they needed a brew that could fill them up because during Lent, they were required to fast for 40 days. So solid food was not allowed, but the monks were permitted to drink as much liquid as they wanted. So a craft beer religious loophole was born. They brewed their first Doppelbock, or extra strong bock, that they called Salvatore. Legend has it that the monks created a beer so delicious that they feared that it was a sin, so they felt it necessary to send the new brew to the Vatican for papal approval. Now, the very long and hot journey to Rome spoiled the beer, so when the Pope took his first gulp, he was totally repulsed. He immediately approved the beer by papal decree, believing the brew of the Paulaner monks would humble any person that dared to take a swig. Now, this meant the monks got to drink their awesome-tasting, non-spoiled beer every year during Lent. And since that original decree, no pope has rescinded it. So Salvatore, which is still brewed today, stands as being approved by His Holiness. So in honor of the first Pope, St. Peter, I raise my papal-approved Salvatore and say cheers. So what do we actually know historically about the Apostle Peter, his birth, his life, his death?
Well, we know that Peter was a fisherman on the Sea of Galilee, that he was Jewish, that we know around 30 A.D., we know that Christ called Peter to be an apostle. Peter had a family, and Peter amazingly left the entire family to follow Christ. We know that Peter was the fellow among the apostles who did great things and did terrible things. He denied Christ, but within a short time was willing to die for Christ. He was terrified of walking on water, and then he actually walked on water. And so Peter was always a mix. Peter was, however, without question, Christ's primary lieutenant. Christ gave the keys to the kingdom to Peter. And so that's who Peter was. We know that the Bible leaves Peter at the end of the Acts of the Apostles in Antioch around 44 AD. Many people, or a number of people, denied that Peter ever ended up in Rome. But we know Peter wrote two letters, the first and second letters to Peter, that placed Peter in a terrifying place that he describes as Babylon. Of course, there was no Babylon, so it's a mythical deal. We know that Christian tradition has taught for 2,000 years that Peter actually went to Rome and that he was crucified by the great emperor, horrible emperor really, Nero, around 66 AD. Nero had started an immense fire in Rome in order to clear out the middle of Rome for a huge palace for himself. That fire destroyed the great homes of Rome on the Palatine Hill, destroyed the old, ancient, and most revered temple of Jupiter, and many of the ancient temples of Rome. So people were very, very angry. And Nero came up with the scam of blaming the Christians. He executed the Apostle Paul, and he executed the Apostle Peter. We know from letters at the time, that is in 95 AD, that Peter was actually executed there and that his body was thrown on a hill called Vatican Hill. We know that Peter was executed upside down because he asked to be, and that the place he was executed was the Garden of Nero, where terrible tortures of Christians were occurring, throwing little kids to dogs to be torn apart, hoisting Christians up on burning torches to be torches to light the garden. We know of the torture and of the great persecution from the historian Tacitus and from other Roman historians, but they don't write specifically about Peter at that time. What we know about is later letters beginning around 30 years later from people like Bishop Irenaeus going to Rome to die. He writes to his friends, well, I'm really happy to be going to Rome to die, as Peter and Paul did. Around 140, there's a very important letter from Gaius who says, look, and he's writing to a non-believer, and he says, you may not believe in Christianity, but come with me to Rome and I'll show you Peter's marker grave on Vatican Hill. So we know that by 140, there was some sort of a marker called Gaius's marker. We know that the very next thing that happened, important after terrible persecution, was that the Emperor Constantine built the original St. Peter's. He first had to level Vatican Hill, and that becomes very important in the story. He leveled it by filling it, thereby creating an underground that would last for thousands of years. In that underground were many Roman tombs, so-called family tombs, like second homes. That buried it. The foundation remained exactly the same right up until the present. The original St. Peter's, we know, was built out of wood, and it was replaced later by the present St. Peter's, which is, of course, a completely different sort of structure. That all happened around 1500.
So with Constantine, did he level that hill for the purpose of protecting those graves?
No. What happened is, if you think of a hill, this was a hill about 400 yards from Nero's place of execution, Nero's garden. And it was a hill on the main road out of Rome. Romans cremated their dead, and they used tombs as sort of a second home. And so they'd have like the melon tomb. And for 700 years, all the melons, their jars would be placed there, and the tomb would be incredibly ornately decorated with great ceramics, fabulous works of art. 4 or 5 times a year on Vesuvius and other holidays, the melons would all go to that tomb, and they'd celebrate, and they'd say, hey, here's old Uncle Rob, and the like. And the problem is, most of those tombs were on the Appian Way, and so the great barbarian invasions destroyed all of them, and they lived only in legend. Well, there were a number of those tombs, as the Appian Way filled up, that actually were built on that little hill, Vatican Hill. And although it started as a dump, it became a very fashionable place to build huge Roman tombs. And they were all built after Peter was originally buried there.
Could you explain the Vatican searches for St. Peter's tomb in 1513, then and again in 1683?
Yeah. Constantine had actually filled the hill in roughly 315 AD with fill. He did that because he couldn't knock down the Roman tombs. There would have been a revolution. So the hill became a vast underground, hidden underground of Roman life, really. All the tombs were buried for hundreds of years, 1,300 years. And with the great barbarian invasions, everyone forgot what was there. There was no one left around other than the legend that Peter had been buried there. Around 1500, the great St. Peter's Church, which was made of wood, was falling down. So the church had no choice but to replace it. And in the process of replacement, the one thing they did was leave the foundation in place. But they, in 1500, again in 1600, they actually drove shafts down to try and find Peter. What they found instead in the second shaft, all they found were the remains of pagan graves. 1600 excavation found the actual statue of a man who was holding up a wine glass. It was his tomb statuary, and he said, "Look, bring me the young women and drink your wine unwatered, because you too will die." That's almost exactly what it said. Well, the priest ran into this. This was not what they were looking for under the Vatican, particularly since the Protestant Reformation claimed that Peter had never gone to Rome, or some people in it did, a few. And so they threw the statue away, sealed the two shafts, and said, forget about looking what's under the Vatican. They were absolutely terrified that all they'd find was a pagan graveyard.
In your book, you kind of detail the more modern search, which is the preponderance of your book. Can you describe what's going on in the world at that time and what prompts the new search?
What was going on? The world, of course, was in terrible turmoil. In 1939, the Nazis were on the march. The fascists controlled Italy. And much of the Christian world had dissolved. Mexico was in terrible chaos. Poland was cut to pieces between the communists and the Nazis. France fell, and Eastern Europe, Soviet was the day of the Soviets in the Soviet Union and other places. In 1939, February 11th, the old Pope, a man named Pope Pius XI, a wonderful man, a mountain climber, a man for all ages, died. He was much loved. His deathbed wish was to be buried under the Vatican. Fairly unusual wish, but his successor decided to do exactly that, honor the wish. So they began digging under the Vatican an altar and a grave for Pius XI. As they dug, what happened is literally a workman ended up falling through a hole that appeared almost 30 feet down. It was one of the most important falls in the history of archaeology. He looked around and he was in a giant family tomb, the tombs of legend. There was a massive chariot of ceramic underneath him. There were paintings of rhinoceroses and all kinds of animals from Africa and the like, and also grave math and so on. So he knew that's what it was. They summoned the Pope and others. They went down into that family tomb, and they found nearby the most amazing thing of all, which was a first century Christian grave of a woman named Amelia Guarducci. They knew it was Christian because it was marked with two things. It was marked with a jar, a woman pouring a jar, the Samaritan woman, which is a very early Christian artifact. And secondly, the fabled fish that the Christians often use. And so all of a sudden, here they are. They're less than 400 yards from the ancient palace of Nero, and there's a Christian grave. It just can't be, because in the first century and all up until the third and fourth century, the Romans are killing every single Christian they can find. There are almost no Christian artifacts. Of the first 32 popes, every one of them is executed by the Romans without fail. Every one dies terribly. And so to find a Christian artifact that close to Nero's palace is just inconceivable. They summoned the Pope, Pius XII. Pius XII had believed since he was a little boy that St. Peter's, directly under St. Peter's, you would find St. Peter. He believed in the early apostles. He believed in the legends surrounding Peter. After locating a bunch of documentation, he ordered that the project go forward, but they didn't have any money. Catholic Church was wildly broke at the time because all of its sources of revenue in Spain and the United States was the Great Depression. Had nothing. And so he got a young priest who would be important in the history of the world named Walter Carroll to go all the way to Texas to meet with an oilman named George Strake and see if Strake would finance it. Walter Carroll asked Strake, Mr. Strake, thank you for all you've done. The Pope has sent me to ask one question, which is, are you willing to finance the most secret and most important project of the Catholic Church? If you do that, no one will ever know you've done it, and the project will probably fail. And Strake said, yes, I'm in.
That's just so amazing. Yeah, there's a misconception that the church has all of this money, and as you detail, the church is actually broke and has to go to the United States to Houston to find an oil man, and then his whole story. Could you go into some detail about George Strake? Because I enjoyed that aspect of your book too.
George Strake was born in St. Louis. He was the 10th of 10 children. His parents died when he was very young, and his two eldest sisters raised all those kids inconceivably. Now, the family obviously had nothing, and George, other than a couple of years of elementary school, never went to school. He never went to high school, that is, or grammar school. He was a Western Union messenger. He made $9 a week. He gave $2 a week to the Catholic Church and $7 to his sisters. And one thing he did, he was self-taught, literally. He loved to read the Bible in particular, and he taught himself to read along with his sisters, and he was self-educated. Around 1913, he took the entrance examination to go to St. Louis University on a lark. There was no real chance, silly. He'd never been to high school, and he passed it. Inconceivably, he passed it. And the folks at St. Louis University learned that he was a broke kid who had never been to high school, and they admitted him on a full scholarship. He went to St. Louis University, took geology and engineering. He was a very good student. He got out of the university to go fight in World War I. He was with the Army Air Corps in the First World War and was a wireless operator. After the war, he went down to make his fortune, supervised an office of Gulf Oil in Veracruz, Mexico. And Veracruz was alive with oil finds at the time. His wife, he married a woman named Susan, who was much of the heart of his life. And Susan became good friends with the people next door. The people next door were the Buckleys, Tim Buckley Sr. and his whole family, his little family. Susan took care of them as a babysitter. They went to George and said, hey, George, why don't you go into business for yourself down here and we'll finance you? He did that. He was very successful in the oil business. He left Mexico before the government seized everything. He went to Cuba and tried to go in the car business, failed there. As he said to Susan, let's get out of here before we have to swim back. He came back to the United States. He was going to go to Oregon. Susan's mother was dying at Methodist Hospital in Houston, and so they stayed there. But George couldn't stay in a hospital room the whole time. So he went walking around south of a little town called Conroe, and he noticed that all the creeks in Conroe flowed the wrong way. They flowed north instead of flowing south. And he also noticed that the animals, the deer, the cows, wouldn't drink the water of any kind. And so from that, he believed, and little else, he believed that there was a huge oil dome there located under the ground. He leased up 10,000 acres for $10 an acre. This is the middle of the Great Depression, so about $1,000. He went to all the oil companies. They all laughed at him. They said, you don't have any seismic, you don't have any technical information. As he said, they thought I was a crazy wildcatter, but they didn't know I was a team of two with God on my shoulder. He drilled the first time, and it was only gas. And so he went back to his wife, Susan, and he said, Susan, I want to drill a second time, but if I do that, we're going to be out in the street. We're going to be homeless if it doesn't hit. Do I have your permission to do that? And Susan said, George, I'll do that. I'll consent on one condition. What's that? I said, George, my condition is that if you hit oil like you think, you will never question anything else I buy for the rest of my life, which is exactly what happened. Susan became First, George drilled that second well. It was the biggest single oil find, third biggest single oil find in the history of the United States. It was the third largest oil field ever uncovered. In World War II, more than 500 million barrels of crude oil on Georgia's interest alone went through the Big Inch pipeline to New York and then to England to supply the English, keep them in the war, and then to supply all of our troops in England. So he became immeasurably wealthy. However, he believed he should give everything away. He thought that the oil field was given to him by God, not for him to use, but to actually support other things, particularly the Catholic Church, but other Christian charities like the Billy Graham folks and so on, all of which, the Boy Scouts, all of which he contributed to. His only condition was always that the gift he made be held completely secret, that the people getting it promised that they would not attribute it to him, and that they would take it, accept it, use it in a good way, but never attribute it to him. He did that both because he believed in the biblical passage that says either take credit here or in the next world, and also because he told his son, George Jr., George, if people learned we were giving money away like this, we'd have thousands of people right here outside our door. And so that's what he did. He gave it away secretly and in massive, inconceivable amounts.
Is it Walter Carroll that knows about George Strake and his money, or does the Pope have some sort of connection with George Strake?
Then Pope Pius XI knew about Strake, and Pope Pius XII, because he'd been giving many millions of dollars to the Catholic Church beginning roughly 1933. Walter Carroll was dispatched to the United States because he was at the Secretary of State's office, and the Strakes developed a very close relationship with Walter Carroll. He was the go-between who helped them to get money to the Catholic Church, and much later, just the Jews in Italy. Remember, the country within a short time is at war. So actually being able to get money to the Catholic Church is quite difficult, and also being able to assist the Jews, which Walter Carroll and the Strakes did in the Second World War, is also very difficult. And Walter Carroll was, together with two other people, were the keys to doing this. There was Walter Carroll, who was from Pittsburgh. The second was Joseph McGow. McGow was a Catholic priest, a wonderful man, but truly sort of a con man. He conned the Nazis into allowing him, under various nom de plume, to operate a so-called refugee bureau that helped to save hundreds of thousands of Jewish Italians, as well as American bomber pilots. They were both aided by a third man, Giovanni Montini, little tiny guy. Well, the little tiny guy became Pope Paul VI, fundamental in the history of Christianity, and also quite clever. And so the Pope was basically taking his very best people and putting them on this project.
It's amazing to me that George Strake is approached. I can just imagine what you would say when you're approached with this specific situation. I mean, it's pretty phenomenal. Why is the search so secret, though?
Well, Rob, can I say one thing about George?
Yeah, absolutely.
You have to understand, George is a wildcatter. George is the guy who drills for oil where everybody thinks there is no oil. Impossible thing. So when you go to George and you say, hey, I have a project, we don't know if it'll succeed or not, and so on, he goes, hey, this is my kind of deal. This is exactly what I've done my entire life. And that's why George is such a perfect choice. He also is able to actually help them with the project in a couple of ways, probably discuss a little later. They also keep the project itself secret. They're starting in 1939. They're surrounded by the fascists. The fascists believe that they're descendants of the Romans. They don't believe in Christ or anything, but they do believe that the Romans are great. If they learn about all those Roman tombs, there's a pretty fair chance they're going to seize all of them. Also, the Pope is very concerned not to let false information, false claims of success, or claims of failure out. He wants to actually control the information out until it reaches a resolution, until scientifically, and Pius is very much a guy that loves science, and archaeology, until it's confirmed one way or the other. And so that's why they conduct the entire project astoundingly, only with hand tools. They don't string electrical lines. They don't use electrical power tools. They do it actually all by hand, just like the Romans put it in 2,000 years before. Incredibly hard conditions. The temperature reaches 110, 120 degrees sometimes. Very dangerous because they can have landfalls, from the vast cathedral above them. And they go forward with the project. The very first thing they discover, astoundingly, is that tomb that was discovered is only one of many. That there are at least 23 or 24 Roman tombs, one by one by one, going up the street. If you can imagine, the lowest is now 90 feet below ground, and the highest is 30 feet below ground. They were all sitting on a hill. They were the center of Rome. They were the great place for people to go and so on. The Christians were a terrible group of people that they were pursuing. Now, all of a sudden, they're all buried 90 feet below ground, and they have a Christian church on top of them. I've always wondered what the spirits of those tombs think. Going to be there for eternity, they figured. And here they were. At least people are now looking at their tombs again. I guess that's good.
I just got this interesting thought, and I might be off base here, but I know that Adolf Hitler was interested in religious artifacts, even the occult. Is there any fear by the Pope that when he hears what they're actually going after, it may not just be the Italians, it may be others that are interested as well?
Oh, very much. When 1943 rolls around, what happens is the fascists govern Italy until 1943. Of course, they joined the war on behalf of the Nazis. They were not good soldiers. They were not Roman legions, and they crumbled like rabbits in North Africa with the British and the Americans. The British and Americans invade Sicily, and they start up the boot of Italy. At that point in time, the Italian government falls, and they imprison Mussolini and try and make peace. Hitler then frees Mussolini, and he seizes all of Italy and begins to fight the Americans. That puts Nazis now in control of Rome. The huge Roman Jewish population of 1 million is really threatened with the same sort of horrible death that Hitler visited on Jews all over Europe. That creates a terrible problem. The Catholic Church intervenes in every way it possibly can. They hide many Jews in this underground under the Vatican. They create a deal, for example, called the North American College, and it's used to hide the Jewish grandfather of a family right here in Houston. As it turns out, they're all disguised as priests, and other scams are used to try and hide them from the Germans until the terrible threat of death passes. At the very same time, the Nazis are very interested in both the Pope and in St. Peter's. When it looks like Rome may fall, Hitler gives orders to the commandant of the Rome garrison to destroy the city and to seize the Pope and bring him back to Berlin. He refuses to comply with those orders. At least he doesn't comply with the orders. So the Pope is spared, and the great works, the Parthenon, the wonderful the Colosseum, St. Peter's, the great churches of Rome are spared. At the very same time, earlier, there was a considerable amount of belief that the Americans should take out Rome. American forces landed in Anzio, 35 miles from Rome, and they were trapped on the beachhead. The Germans who trapped them were all being supplied out of Rome. The Americans lost more people on that beachhead at Anzio than in the entire Normandy campaign. 52,000 Americans were either killed or captured at Anzio, the largest single campaign losses of the Second World War. And it could have been brought to an end by destroying Rome and the logistical lines that led from Rome to the beachhead at Anzio. At any rate, at Anzio, the Americans, ended up losing 52,500 people either captured or killed. Yet they did not take out Rome. The Nazi commandant of the Rome garrison ignored his orders to destroy Rome. And so Rome was saved, almost miraculously saved. And the guy on both ends negotiating was Walter Carroll, the young priest from Pittsburgh. Specifically, General Clark, who was in charge of all Allied forces in Italy, said he changed the entire course of World War II. Blauschweiss, Eisenhower's chief of staff, said the very same thing. And of course, he played a tremendous role also in saving Jews in the concentration camps at the very end of the war. And so at his funeral, there were letters from Truman. There were many Jewish survivors of concentration camps, and there were many different salutations from around the world, which was sort of amazing because he was a guy that treasured obscurity and didn't seek fame of any kind.
So if we can get back to the archaeological dig, they were having some issues. How does the inclusion of Margherita Guarducci change the dynamic of the entire operation?
What happens is they go through, they find the marker inserted sometime before 140, and so it's the marker right over Peter's grave called Gaius's marker, Gaius's trophy. They look for Peter's bones. They find some bones that are close to there, but not directly under, and they sort of declare a victory, but remain totally secret. What happens is in 1949, word leaks out from some unknown source that Peter's tomb has been discovered. The Pope appears on the radio and confirms the front page report saying, "We've discovered the tomb. We don't know whether or not we've discovered the bones." The Strakes are all called, the whole family of 5, go to Rome to receive the congratulations of the Pope. And meantime, George has been working on this project along with the Pope all along. They meet with the Pope. We'll never know exactly what happened in the meeting between George Strake, Montini, later Pope Paul, and Pope Pius XII. Here's what I think happened. My speculation is I think that we know the Pope had trouble with he was very worried about the archaeological dig because it had all been done in-house by priests secretly without outside experts. And so he was concerned that it had been done the right way because it was so important. I convinced, Strake said, "Your Excellency, let's find the best man in the world, and I'll fund him completely." And they said, "Well, George, there's a problem. The best man in the world is not a man. It's a woman. It's a woman named Margherita Guarducci." So I can picture George Strait saying, well, let's go hire her. Let's just hire her. They go, "Well, she's a good Catholic just like us." And they said, no, George, she's not a Catholic. She's an agnostic. And nonetheless, astoundingly, the Pope proceeded to hire the woman who was the greatest, probably the greatest living, well, certainly the greatest living epigrapher and probably the greatest archaeologist in the world in 1951. She took a look at it all, and she went back and told the Pope, "You've done a terrible job. No one's preserving these great Roman tombs. No one's even photographing them. There's incredible inscriptions that you've dismissed just as graffiti, but these are inscriptions made by the very earliest Christians in the world because they're made before 330 AD. No one's bothered to really look at them or figure out what they mean." And the Pope, you'd think, would be angry, but he wasn't at all. And what he amazingly did was fire the entire team of priests that had worked on it. He excluded them from going into the project, and he placed Margherita Guarducci in complete control of the project. Guarducci, you have to understand, she was honestly like an idiot savant. She would get on a task, and she'd spend infinite time and care to solve a puzzle. She was famous for solving the great puzzle, what was called the Great Epigraph, which actually gave us all the laws of a Greek city-state off a series of walls, which took her 24 years. So once he brought her aboard, the very first thing she did was turn to all the written materials, the actual writings these Christians were etching, and others were etching before 330 AD. Her solution of those remains one of the most important Christian archaeological finds of all history. She learned that the Christians, who were at this point being killed by the Romans, used a code. They used the Churro symbol for Christ. They used a Roman T for a cross, and they used a B for victory and an R for redemption. So they'd have Churro symbol, line, cross, line, victory, or redemption, the letters for them. They'd have Peter, Omega Alpha, the last letter of the Greek alphabet, the first letter. meaning Peter died, but Peter will live again. The same thing with Christ. And so they incorporated in a code that the Romans could never have understood because they weren't Christian, all the basic tenets of the Christian faith, and they did that in the first century and early second century.
When do they actually verify that the bones, or get as close as they can to verify that the bones actually belong to Peter? Because they discovered the bones, I believe, in 1942 that you had referenced before.
Right.
But the Pope doesn't announce it officially until 1968. So with the specific bones of St. Peter, what's happening throughout that time period there?
Amazing story. Well, they found the bones in 1942. They put them in the Pope's apartment, pretty convinced that that's what they had found because it was fairly close to the Pius's marker. When Margherita Guarducci arrived, she immediately insists that the bones be tested by a great forensic anthropologist, a wonderful doctor named Carenti, the greatest forensic anthropologist at that point in the world. He tests the bones over a period of about a year and a half, and he says, forget it, fellas, these aren't Peter's bones. These are the bones of a woman, not a man. They can't be Peter. And so there's a complete mystery at that point in time as to where Peter's bones actually went. 18 inches from Gaius's marker is a wall. She finds over and over again on the wall inscriptions, Peter is here. Peter is done with like a P symbol with two keys. Peter, 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 21 different times on the wall. And then she looks down, and in the wall, there's a hole in the wall. Well, what had happened was in the excavation, in order to get into the dead center, Pius's trophy is plumb bobbed down from the center of the cathedral. They had broken this wall up, and there had been bones inside, and they sent the bones off to storage unexamined. And so the bones had sat there since roughly 1942 or 43 when they came through. They were carefully labeled and put in a box. Well, when she finds out that those bones were in the wall, she immediately gets the bones and sends them to Professor Carenti, the great forensic anthropologist, as a first step. Carenti looks at the bones. The bones, first of all, used to be under the marker, under Gaius's marker. They used to be in the soil, directly under that marker, and they were moved. They were moved sometime before 330, but after 250 AD. They are wrapped, or were wrapped, and still are wrapped, in a cloth that is purple and gold. Purple means, purple is a sign of royalty. Anybody that uses purple in the Roman Empire gets executed because they're claiming to be emperor. And gold the same way. The purple dye is from the 3rd century. And so the movement of the bones can clearly be dated before 330 and after 250. So are these Peter or not? The other thing Carenti says is these are the bones of a man. The man is 65 years old, roughly 60 to 70 years old, and he's been crucified upside down. He still has nail marks. His feet are cut off, as the Romans were wont to do. So he's a guy crucified in the time of Nero, buried under that marker, and then moved to the wall around 250 AD, from whence he remains for the next 1,700 years, undiscovered until 1942. She thinks that's pretty good evidence. She goes to see, by this time, Pope Paul, and Paul assembles a whole team of 6 different scientists. They all look at it and they say, this is Peter, okay? And so the Pope announces in 1966 the discovery of Peter the Apostle's bones under the Vatican.
How does the world receive that news? Did you go back in your research in the 60s?
Oh, yeah.
To determine how it was received?
Oh, absolutely received with wild enthusiasm, certainly by the Catholic world. And it appears, there wasn't any great cynicism about it of any kind. The one person who was cynical about it, when the Guarducci was brought aboard, they fired the old head of archaeology, a man named Antonio Ferrua. And Ferrua very much disbelieved that was Peter. He still believed that perhaps the original bones that were identified as those of a woman were Peter, and disbelieved that the bones he had overlooked in the wall were the bones of Peter the Apostle. And so he argued strongly against it, but he was, overruled by all existing scientists and ultimately by Pope Paul VI, who himself wrote a long inscription to Margherita Guarducci's books explaining the discovery.
Could you speak a little bit about how important it was for Pope Pius XII to accept scientific archaeology? It's a religious figure like the Pope to embrace science.
Yeah, it was really interesting. When Pius first became a pope, Leo Pope, and Leo reflected a late 19th century view that was very strongly opposed to science. Understand that the world had been racked up by things purporting to be science, like Marx, and things that actually were science, like Darwin. And so these were earth-shaking deals. And so Leo actually wrote, look, let's not confuse people with science, basically. I mean, Leo basically had to say. Pope Pius XII was completely different. Pope Pius XII believed passionately that science properly followed would authenticate his beliefs, the beliefs of Christianity. And so he took exactly the opposite. He said, please educate everybody in science. Let's accept scientific truth and let's use it and so on everywhere we can. And so archaeology was one part of science he truly loved. And that's why he was such a perfect pope for pursuing the search under the Vatican.
And now Pope Francis is a chemist, I believe.
He is. And what happened was, after everybody died, after Pope Paul died, George Strake died pushing a car up a hill in the hot sun, and all the people in the team died. After all that occurred, 3 days after Paul died, Peru came in and fired Garducci and took the bones and placed them back in storage, and then eradicated any mention of Garducci from the literature in the Vatican. But Garducci, even though she was 75, was a tough character. And Garducci wrote over and over again about the authenticity of her finds. She also, amazingly, at the age of 84, made some of the other epic discoveries for the Christian world, basically solving the mystery of the Black Madonna. That's sort of where things stood until Pope Benedict arrived. Pope Benedict did careful study once again with many scientists, and so did Pope Francis. And in 2013, at St. Peter's Square, in front of a crowd of 8,000 people, Pope Francis held out a box containing Peter's bones and said, "Behold the bones of Peter." And it became the official finding of the Catholic Church that those were Peter's bones. In addition, Pope Francis and many theologians, both Catholic and Protestant, point to those archaeological etchings that Garducci found as among the most important archaeological etchings of any kind ever found in terms of the Christian world. The reason they're so important is that people claim that Christianity was an evolving cult, that really they sort of got it together in the 5th century. And the problem with that whole deal is these etchings, which are made by Christians about to be killed, embrace the basic theology of the Bible and prove that it existed from the very beginning.
Can you explain what people would see today if they went to that location where Peter's grave is? Can they visit that site?
Oh, it's a fabulous thing. Many people that I've talked to believe it's the greatest thing that they've ever seen in Europe. It's called the Scavi Tour, and I first have to say it's a hard ticket to get, and to get it, you have to go to the Vatican travel office, and there are many crooks purporting to sell tickets to the Scavi Tour that are not real tickets. The only place you can get one is from the Vatican travel office. But if you apply and have the right day, you can get one. The reason it's so hard to get is there are only 150 to 200 people a day that are allowed. But you start at the very bottom. Imagine this hill. You start at the very bottom, and you go up, and you're passing some of the greatest existing Roman art and tombs in the world. You go past Tomb of the Mossis. Mr. and Mrs. Mossi have a tomb for their family. In front, there's a deal with both of them in it. It has inscribed on it. It has first their likenesses, and it has inscribed on it in Latin, "Together forever," for eternity. And then around them are drawings and paintings from Euripides' plays, half of which we know about and half of which we don't know about. So we see Hercules going down to hell to rescue a princess from hell. We see the mother of a king killing the king because she's mad, and those plays survive, and others that don't even exist anymore. And so it's like a big movie room. You can imagine the family gathering here in the centuries to celebrate their ancestors. Close by is the tomb of the Belerians, which to me is always one of the saddest tombs. At one end are these proud statues, bronzes of the Belerians, and you look at them, and they're got just typical proud Roman, as you'd imagine them, of the whole family, the father, the daughter, and a small grandchild, and perhaps others, but at least those three. On the other end are their death masks, and you learn that the grandchild died first, and then the daughter died, and finally the grandfather died. And his whole family was gone by the time he died in a plague in Rome. And so they're fabulous. You continue further up the hill, and you pass all the Roman tombs, and now you're passing Christian graves. They're little tiny. The Christian graves are small, almost unmarked. The difference, of course, is the Romans believed that they would be there for eternity. The Christians saw their grave as just a gate. Of the first 32 popes, all of them were killed. A number of them were buried there. Of the very early popes, close to Peter, because that's where they wanted to be buried. Finally, you get to the wall that Peter's in, and the trophy of Gaius has been excavated. You see those, and there's an altar. So it's all in all kind of an amazing experience, whether you're a Christian or simply love archaeology.
So I have one last question for you. Do you think there are any other secret Vatican searches going on as we speak?
Oh, well, for sure. They discovered more tombs under a parking lot. The Vatican excavated a parking lot and discovered other Roman tombs there. But I don't think they're secret anymore. And I don't think that they have a program to excavate further into the Vatican, although it would be interesting to know what else is actually down there. There are other graves in another part of under the Vatican from the 18th and 19th century. The last of the Stuart kings is buried there. One of the great Swedish queens is buried under there. And so there are other people buried there in other sections. The Scavi tour is obviously the thing everybody wants to see.
Well, thank you very much, John. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was an honor to appear on your show. Thank you.
I would like to thank my guest today, New York Times bestselling author John O'Neill. If you'd like to get his book, The Fisherman's Tomb, just click on the link in the notes below. The featured brew was Paulaner Salvatore Doppelbock from the Paulaner Brewery in Munich, Germany. Now, it's been brewed since 1638 and approved by His Holiness himself by papal decree. If you liked our talk today, please share the episode with a friend. And remember to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the podcast directory that you use and get new episodes immediately after they are released. Subscribing is the only way to get new shows right away. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, who are producing new material as we speak, and we're looking forward to that. And to the growing list of listeners from 40 countries and hundreds of cities across the United States, I'd like to say thank you. And there are many more great episodes on the way. Discussions on the Napoleonic Wars, Pearl Harbor, a young JFK, and the Civil War. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.